Hi, this is Phil Newman from Longevity.Technology, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by Richard Marshall, the CEO of Juvenescence. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Phil, and thanks very much for having me today.
Well, it's great to have you here, Richard. And of course, you're fully committed to a longevity business now, having jumped in from AstraZeneca, traditional pharma. So was that an easy decision to make?
Actually, it was an easy decision, particularly as I got to understand Juvenescence. The mission they're on, getting to know the founders and how passionate they are about the company and the mission, and also getting to know the pipeline. And I very quickly understood why they needed somebody with a long track record in pharma R&D because we've got such a rich pipeline to progress. So yeah, when you add those three things together, mission, team, founders, and pipeline, uh, there wasn't any hesitation from my perspective. And I think the other is that I've devoted my career to improving health, and I think there's a long way to go for therapeutics, and we have a pipeline of therapeutics. But what I really like, and of course, you guys and longevity are ahead of me, is this sort of conceptual change to how you go about improving health.
Yeah, well, of course, there's a whole narrative that's changing now, and of course, we'll talk about how that is perceived by investors as well. But obviously, the Juvenescence approach is kind of hybrid, as I understand it. You have portfolio companies that are developing their own clinical pipeline. It looks to me like you've got some projects, as it were, that you perhaps might be incubating. So, could you tell us a little bit more about Juvenescence's business approach?
Absolutely. So, actually, the whole project started with Jim Mellon, I think, who is as an investor par excellence and very noted for looking into the future and trying to understand what are the things that are going to be most meaningful in terms of their impacts on society and the economy. And he identified the demographic shifts that we're all very familiar with that are happening across the globe, and I think recognise that this wasn't just going to be an incremental sort of increase in the burden of healthcare, but was going to be an enormous change that will provide potentially catastrophic health economic burden. So Jim, under the guise of writing a book, really went and talked to the world leading academics in the space. And those conversations really formed the basis for building a pipeline because, through those conversations and obviously through scientific discussion and diligence, we were able to strike up a number of partnerships and collaborations with those academic institutions, notably, for example, the Buck Institute and Tufts and so on. And then from there, establish companies, entities that would hold the IP and then start to incubate and develop them, into the pipeline we have now. And what's happened over time is obviously as we built the team and built those companies, we're sort of pivoting so that we're kind of mixed at the moment of companies that have their own leadership. For example, Biomass and Ligenesis, which have their own CEOs and leadership teams. And then there are some that are actually under the core company. But really, we work very closely together. So, I regard it as being sort of the most agile way to sort of manage the science, the intellectual property, to get the right teams around each project. And then I think from an investor point of view, there's a diversity within the pipeline. There's diversity of thinking, and for partners, potential future partners, it also makes them easier for them to work with us because they can invest in a company as a whole, they can invest in a single company, and similarly for licensing or partnership deals. It makes it quite easy for us to do that from a sort of mechanics point of view. But really, we're all on the same mission. And when I talk to investors about the pipeline, we talk about it as a single joined up pipeline that has a coherence and connectivity. So yeah, we're kind of hybrid. Our main focus, I mean, just to be absolutely clear, is a biopharmaceutical pipeline of potential medicines.
So, with that selection of those companies and those interventions, Richard, is there a thesis that sits between all of those? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
selecting your targets is going to be independent, I guess, scientifically, but is there a correlation across the portfolio that you see that there's a general direction of travel that Juvenescence is moving toward?
There is. So let me start at sort of the most sort of macro level. I mean, part and core to our mission, and it's something we're very clear about in all the conversations we have, is that ultimately, and it's where health economies and societies need to go. We need to have interventions of various kinds that start much earlier in life, to prevent the kind of problems that we store up as we get older, and thereby improve health spans. So prevention is actually a key part of our strategy. I'm a physician by training, and I've worked a long time in healthcare and in pharma R&D, and of course I understand that any intervention is always about risk benefit, and so there are kind of two ways to come at this, I think, and both are being prosecuted right now by us and by many companies. I mean, the first is you can actually come from sort of nutrition, supplements, and ingredients perspective. And I think the challenge there is to provide really optimized, well validated, quality controlled interventions in the nutritional supplement ingredient space that people could take with some precision as well. I think that's another, step that needs to be made, which is that we provide the right interventions in that space for the right individual. So with some precision that they can take at various stages of their life to improve their current health and health span. So there's a kind of journey there, I think, to optimize and improve those sorts of interventions coming from that side. And the reason that I talked about two sides is partly because of that sort of safety question, which is with natural products, there is a general sense that these are safe things to do, but it's all about, well, are they the right things to do for an individual? But otherwise, the safety aspect is sort of built into the natural sourcing of those interventions. Now, on the other hand, it is from a sort of medicines perspective, so novel, small and large molecule therapeutics that, in the traditional sense, that you can use. Now, our approach is, and this is actually the mainstay of our pipeline, is to build a pipeline based on mechanisms that fundamentally we believe, and there's evidence to support it, drive the underlying sort of aging process that so interrupts and disturbs health span and leads to chronic disease. So rather than thinking about plucking mechanisms from an individual disease and starting disease down, we start from kind of aging up, spot those mechanisms, and then say, look, there's probably a two-step process here. Firstly, to understand those interventions, those medicines, how they perform once given to patients with established disease. So you deliver clinical benefit to patients that have current disease. And as you understand the mechanism, you understand the benefit risk of that intervention, that medicine, then you can think about going earlier in disease. Then you could move to sort of high risk individuals of disease in sort of late preventative mode, if you will, and then you could go into full preventative mode into healthy people, and that will depend on the individual mechanism and asset. But our pipeline's predicated on those sort of 2 to 3 steps, really. Firstly, target mechanisms that we believe have a strong rationale for being able to improve health span or longevity, and that will be based on clinical human data and or preclinical animal models or other data. Start in therapeutic mode, understand the mechanism, deliver value to patients, deliver value to investors in the shorter term, but always with an eye, and it'll vary to moving into preventative mode. So that's the way that our pipeline's been kind of put together and the thinking behind it.
So interesting that obviously you're still looking at effectively food supplementation as a aspect to the portfolio. I'd like to come back to that in a moment. So in relation then to your commercial model, you mentioned already, Richard, the potential of partnering. So you've got Ligenesis is moving into phase 2 or is in phase 2. There are a lot of the other aspects of your portfolio are pre-IND or IND enabling. So what is the strategy? I mean, are you going to catalyze to bring these therapeutics to market yourself, or will the plan be to bring that portfolio into alignment with Big Pharma partners?
Yeah, I mean, in the main, it will be to partner, because we think we're targeting the mechanisms that underlie more than just one disease. You know, the potential to get the best out of those medicines will mean doing, you know, potentially multiple phase 3 trials and different indications. So, you know, that's going to be a task for a big company. But a couple of points to make. I mean, firstly, because we pick targets that have that sort of scientific precedent, that have the sort of strong rationale, they're not going to be targets that have come out of the blue to potential partners. So the way I'm thinking about how we develop the medicines in the clinic is that we can really generate data quite early in development, given that strong pre-existing rationale. um, we can do things in relatively small numbers of patients that show that we can, you know, hit the right target, that we can do that safely, that we can move, for example, now some of the emerging, I think, quite, you know, intriguing and uh, really helpful markers of senescence, you know, epigenetic aging, and so on. So we can actually build a package into a well characterized, carefully selected group of patients. And of course, most patients that have chronic disease are older, so they'll be carrying a lot of these signals, if you will, that we can look at. And you put those two things together and say, well, we've got a medicine in the clinic already in early development. This could be the end of phase 1 or early phase 2, that's showing that it, you know, does what it says on the tin. It hits the target. It moves the mechanism. It moves markers of the disease, and it moves markers of aging or senescence. That's a very strong package, and we'd be expecting to talk to, you know, potential partners quite early in development, because I
And
think for some of these, that, you know, they're frankly, the world's waiting for these kind of treatments.
Totally. I mean, the world is waiting for them, and we'll come to that, if I may, in just a moment. But when you're looking at the mechanisms and the multiple shots on goal across the different portfolio companies,
Yeah.
would you see that you would take one disease target with one potential partner, and that partner might have a disease focus, whether it's perhaps cardiovascular disease or fibrosis or whatever it may be, where you could actually jump to another potential farmer with the same portfolio asset, but with a different disease target, as you go through those stages of, obviously, first of all, selecting a disease, improving the efficacy that way, before you then start to move perhaps to a wider systemic rejuvenation approach.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, a couple of 2 or 3 points to make. I mean, firstly, we'll be kind of living and breathing this, as we go into next year, as we've got 2 to 5 medicines that will all translate now into clinical development. So we're going to be very busy in the clinic, 2024 and beyond. The potential. I mean, firstly, I think it's important to show the potential of the medicine. I said, by just showing that it does what you expect in terms of the basic pharmacology. And then, as I say, I think we can look at, in parallel, you know, a patient group where you can most readily demonstrate an impact on the mechanism, most readily demonstrate an impact on that individual disease, and also look at potential markers of aging longevity. And I think it's perfectly possible to select the right patients that achieve all three, so that you can sort of screen them. So you don't have to sort of feel your way. You pre-screen to get the right people to test all those things. And then in terms of multiple indications, and again, there's potential right across our pipeline for each medicine to go into potential multiple indications. I mean, usually, you know, an individual, you know, big company will kind of want to own an individual asset. So, you know, they'll want to have that for probably, you know, all indications. But what we do have, in a number of cases, the potential for actually a pipeline in and of itself. So, for example, with our chemistry around CD38 inhibition, the antibodies, and we have, you know, a number of assets in the pipeline in biomass, for example, that are targeting the same mechanism in different ways. So we've definitely got the opportunity to kind of follow on with, you know, iterations, either complementary or, you know, incremental improvements, that again, for partners, means that they could take those into different indications that might need, you know, different specifications, different price points, etc. So where we think we've got a kind of rich seam and you know, unique opportunity, definitely, you know, I'm thinking about follow-ons and potential backups to our lead molecules. Yeah.
Mm. Fascinating. And I guess, Richard, in terms of the timescales associated with all of this, frustratingly, we know that clinical development takes time. Regulatory authorities are going to take time, quite rightly, to make choices and approvals. What is the timescale, do you think, associated with perhaps the first part, getting your target diseases, but then potentially that double benefit then of taking it into the longevity sphere, and then maybe the continuation into systemic rejuvenation? What are the sort of timescales that you're seeing for this?
So, I mean, the first thing I'm focused on, having spent 20 years working in the space, is to be honest, not to spend, firstly, in terms of speed of progression, is not to spend too much time into the preclinical development. It's important that we understand the molecule, the mechanism, that we show benefit, but there is a potential to get kind of snarled up, particularly in animal models. Whereas actually, again, what I really like about our pipeline is that we have the tools to kind of do a lot of that interrogation safely in patients. So firstly, it's faster patients. As soon as we've got the right molecule, it's safe. We get into patients and do the experiment there. And I spent a lot of time in so-called translational medicine, and those tools are the ones I've been referring to. Then, as I say, it's building a much more robust phase one study. So again, phase one, going back certainly 20 years ago, it was a bit of a flyover, stage in development. It was like, well, you just dose range and you get to a certain dose, and then you go on in phase two and start to understand efficacy and other things. That's changing now, and there's much more of a continuum of understanding the medicine as you go. So absolutely, safety is paramount. So we need to get the right dose and do that safely in the first instance. But as soon as you've got to the point where you're impacting the mechanism, actually we do better by participants in our trials, and of course do better by the medicine itself, is if we immediately start to ask the key questions. So phase one, A and B can involve patients. That's a sweet spot, because again, I think you can interrogate relatively small, if you excuse the expression, interrogate the science in relatively small groups of patients, but really data rich. And then you can go into phase two in your chosen indication with so much more information, rather than thinking all the answers and necessarily pinned to a doggedly to a single indication that you won't move from. And also, for a lot of these mechanisms, I mean, the right ultimate indication sometimes will change because new information's come along. And again, I'll pick an example, which is, there's a couple, again, CD38 and also the GDF15 activin axis. I mean, as those programs have been advancing, and both are poised to go into the clinic next year, by the way, the science has just been broadening, which means that the potential number of indications is going up. So we should always remain circumspect and watch the science. And then, I think then the next step after that is, to your point, ultimately, if you want to go into prevention mode, how do you do that? And I think once you understand the benefit risk of the medicine, then it's about, I think, going into populations in a stepwise fashion. It'll depend how quickly you can move. So, for example, one of our company's seller is optimizing ketones for a sort of therapeutic approach. So we're aware of ketones for use in supplements, but actually we're optimizing by selecting a particular ketone packaged in a particular way to generate a more pharmacological like concentration of ketones that we think could have long-term benefits. Be much easier to tolerate, take it as a tablet, and actually give you these long-term benefits. Now, given that we already understand a lot about the safety and impact of ketones, that's the kind of medicine where you could quite quickly move into prevention mode. And there are other examples of that. But for others, it may be that you learn with your first molecule at the other end, it's great for severe lung fibrosis or liver disease, but actually you think, okay, but if we want to go to patients who are healthier or at an earlier stage of disease, we need a different molecule that does this, or we understand more about the mechanism and it takes us in a different direction. So, there's multiple ways in which you ultimately get to that sort of prevention paradigm.
Yeah, and of course, Richard, you mentioned earlier the fact that you're still looking into non-therapeutic areas as well. So obviously we saw keto switch, and I can understand with the complexity of running an organization like Juvenescence, there are multiple choices that need to be made. So, are you still committed to the sort of non-therapeutic approach in longevity as well?
I, definitely in this. I mean, I think I do genuinely believe, and I think many do as well, that we, i.e., society, healthcare economies are going to need those sort of earlier points of intervention and early types of intervention. There's a lot of promise in many of the sort of supplements that are being tested and taken by many people. But I think I said there's more work to do to understand how can we make them optimal and how can we target them precisely to the right patient. But absolutely, from a sort of conceptual, health span in its broadest sense perspective, I think they're a really important part of the armamentarium. For us as Juvenescence, the majority of our pipeline is therapeutic. So it's medical therapeutics is where we're spending most of our time and resources. Metabolic switch, which is our ketone supplement, again, we've been working to optimize that as well, to relaunch it later in the year. And we also have other supplement products. And I think all I can say at the moment is kind of watch this space, because we've got a plan for our supplement business. Because I think, having spent some time working in it, I mean, as a company, we've really started to develop a network and expertise, and we think we're in a position to bring together a really strong leadership in that space and create something quite exciting. But that's a bit of a
Mm,
teaser of things to come. But
great.
definitely something there. But that will progress as a sort of standalone sort of supplement enterprise, and the majority of our effort and time resource will be on moving the RX pipeline forward.
Very good. And I guess there's capital is required for all of this, Richard. So the markets are pretty horrible at the moment, as we all know. How's that going in terms of the capital raising to keep the wheels on everything? What's the appetite you're experiencing with investors out there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's some have called it a biotech winter, but things ebb and flow all the time, and you always have to make a really strong case to investors. I think for us, personally or individually, a couple of things. I mean, firstly, we're still recognised as one of the early movers in this field, and as I said at the outset, our founders, Greg Bailey and um, Jim Mellon and Declan Dugan, they're committed. They founded the company based on a passion and a real belief of the potential for help, for health span intervention. So they're a really strong part, I think, of our USP. I think what I've just said about how we're narrating and I think providing hopefully real coherence and clarity for potential investors about why we're doing what we're doing, how supplements have a place, but that's sort of that'll be over here and that'll have its own sort of leadership. That our main focus is on the therapeutic pipeline and the sort of how that pipeline has come together, how we think we can prosecute in the clinic. So I think over the last few months, as we start to talk to investors, and we hope to close our Series C round in the next couple of months, we are definitely getting really good traction. There's definitely a lot of dry powder out there. There's an enormous upsurge in the interest in longevity health span. Well, I don't need to tell you that. I mean, and you've been at the forefront of kind of uh, creating, I think, and pointing to the incredible developments in this space. I've come to this out of large pharmaceutical companies where in the main there isn't so much of a focus on it, but it will shift, I think, and I think biotech's way ahead of the field. So I think you put those together, yeah, we're confident we're going to get the war chest we need. We've got, and I said, in a way, too many things to do. It's a nice problem to have when you've got the potential to get 5 to 7 medicines into the clinic over the next couple of years. So we can prioritize if we have to, but I'd much rather not, because I think they're all potential blockbusters. So we've got good funds at the moment, but definitely we're kind of reaching for the kind of war chest that means that we can progress everything and take it all forward.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear, and of course, congratulations on nearly closing your Series C.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just ask you, Richard, about Ajax, because obviously things look challenging there in relation to the cash position, but of course, cellular reprogramming is a very interesting area. It's attracting a lot of capital at the moment. What's happening with Ajax?
Yes, okay. It's going to be another teaser, I'm afraid, because absolutely, what's happened with Ajax is I think we're taking like a little step backward, but to take a really big leap forward. And those discussions are almost, at the point of coming to fruition, and we can start to talk about it. But all I can say at the moment is absolutely watch out for the news flow over the next couple of months, because yeah, we've got plans to evolve the Ajax model.
Well, that's a good place to leave off. And when you're ready to make that announcement on Ajax, maybe we could get back together again, Richard.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great. Well, thanks very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations on the new role. It's great to have a calibration of Big Pharma coming into our world, and obviously the fact that you guys have got so many things in the pipeline at the moment is very encouraging. So, Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Phil, thanks so much to you, and thanks for the time and everything you're doing at Longevity Technology. Thanks.